Chapter 5. "I thought you owned the airship," said Jest. "It's 2 in the morning," said Gaius, failing to hide his annoyance. Percy cooed softly from Jest's shoulder, as if he were tired too. "So? If you own the airship and paid the crew, then you determine when they sail. I see no reason why we shouldn't just head over to the Dragon Diamond, wake up the crew, and take off for Bastille before Mom and Dad wake up and come searching for us." "And that's why you're the younger brother," said Gaius. "Besides, we're already here." "Here? But this isn't the skyport." Gaius was too tired to argue. Instead, he rummaged through his pockets until he found the key to the lab. He opened the door and motioned Jest and Percy inside. He lit a kerosene lamp and led them to the back room with the bed. "We'll stay here for the rest of the night," said Gaius. "At sunbreak, we'll be at the Dragon Diamond ready for departure, and the crew won't hate our guts for waking them up at 2 in the morning. What about Mom and Dad?" "The first thing they'll do when they discover we're gone is search the lowers. By the time they start searching the underside and topside, we'll be long gone," he said as he blew out the light. They both crawled into the large bed, and it was clear that Jest was actually uncomfortable not being in a cramped hammock. A moment of blissful silence. "Wait a second," cried Jest. "Where exactly are we? Did we just break into someone's house? Are we going to jail?" "No, Jest," soothed Gaius. "I already told you. I work for the Gabian gang. This is the lab I use to make their weapons. We're perfectly safe. Go to sleep." Another moment of silence. "Wait. So you weren't actually lying before," said Jest. "You really are in trouble." "Yes. Now will you shut up and get some sleep?" And this time the silence remained unbroken until morning. The Portuna's skyport was alive. It acted like a living, breathing thing. Its mouth was the dockyard where trade barges and merchant ships from across the world brought grain and barley, steel and lumber, silk and cotton, and gold and silver to engorge its greedy belly. Its eyes and ears were the merchants themselves, reporting on news and gossip from distant lands. Its mind was the administration center that kept the schedule and collected the fees. Its powerful arms were the military vessels going out to keep order in the skies, making sure trade flowed smoothly into the beast's gaping maw. Its legs were the laborers carting supplies and goods wherever they should go. It breathed with the wind of the sea. It called out with the great gull's cry. It knew joy. It knew pain. It knew birth. It knew death. And Gaius, Jest, and Percy found themselves at its very heart, Starton Square. Even in the early light of sunbreak, the roads and walkways of the skyport bustled and clamored with all manner of carts, horses, carriages, wheelbarrows, troops, and thieves, flowing like blood in the arteries and veins of it all. But above the din, above the chorus of calls and yells from below, Gaius could see the long white balloons of the Zeppelins filling the sky. Their sheer size amazed him. He had seen such airships from a distance, but never realized just how massive the balloon had to be in order to carry the ship and masts beneath. Unlike sea ships that had the masts above deck to catch the breeze and power the ship, airships had their masts attached below the hull of the ship in order to add more weight below the balloon, making it far more stable. Usually the masts ran the length of the boat in sets of 3, the main row positioned in the keel itself directly below the ship, and the other 2 sets positioned about 30 degrees on either side of the main. To dock, the airship floated alongside a wrought iron catwalk where the crew would tether it. "Which one is ours?" yelled out Jest above the crowd. "The Dragon Diamond," yelled back Gaius as he adjusted the ram's mask upon his face, making sure it was tight against his black horns. He was optimistic that Keystone's men would not be waiting for him at the docks, but he had learned long ago that there was no such thing as being too careful. "Yes, but what does it look like?" "No idea." Gaius took a moment to appreciate the look of annoyance on Jest's face before continuing. He grinned behind his mask. "But it's docked at platform S13, Gaius said. Shouldn't be too far now." True to his word, not 5 minutes later they arrived at the Dragon Diamond. Small compared to its neighbors, the Dragon Diamond appeared light, nimble, and fast. Rather than having a figurehead at the front of the prow, the entire ship came to a fine edge, like a knife cutting through the air. From stem to stern the ship was the color of the sky, and so were the sails hanging from the mast below. Gaius always thought this design was especially genius, with the masts hanging from the bottom of the keel to provide more ballast and stability, quite the opposite to its seafaring counterparts. The balloon above was enormous, shining with a polished silver like a mirror, reflecting the sky and clouds around it. Gaius wondered if it would make the ship seem almost invisible, especially at night, so not only light, nimble, and fast, but also clever. Gaius approved. "Beautiful, isn't she?" said a wispy, feminine voice from behind. Gaius and Jess spun around. Standing there was a small, mousy woman dressed in a turquoise dress with a leather corset. Her white shirt with flowing sleeves betrayed a petite frame. On her head was a tiny navy blue hat with large peacock feathers, and in her hands she carried a closed parasol umbrella, the shaft of which was resting on her shoulder. But it was what was under the hat that caught Gaius's breath. He had never seen a purer, more innocent face. Wavy, dark auburn hair that matched large hazelnut eyes, a buttoned nose, and a sweet smile impressed upon him a sense of kindness, gentleness, and trust. In that split second of a moment, had she asked anything of him, he would have bared his soul with absolute honesty, believing with firm conviction that she would respond with an understanding gaze and a consoling word that would melt all his worries away. "Sometimes I forget how beautiful she is," whispered the girl in hushed reverence, her eyes fixed intently on the dragon diamond. "It's only when I leave her for a while and then come back again that the magic returns." "Funny how that works," said Gaius. "But it looks like the magic is still fresh for you," she said, "and that makes me glad. Enjoy it while it lasts." "Actually, I was hoping to enjoy it for much longer," said Gaius, "and perhaps you could help me with that. I'm looking for Captain L.R. Featherton. Any idea where I can find him?" A knowing smile crept upon her sweet lips. "As a matter of fact, I have known Captain L.R. Featherton all my life. And if you're a paying customer seeking passage on this fine vessel, I've no doubt he'd be happy to meet you. But beware! Like you, he is not what he seems. Do not underestimate him." The girl led them up the gangway toward the ship itself. "Mind you, watch your step. To fall from a seafaring vessel is one thing, with the soft water to catch your fall. But on an airship, to fall is another thing altogether." Gaius suddenly felt his stomach tighten at the mere thought of falling hundreds of feet. He dared not look over the edge of the gangplank, and when they finally stepped aboard the safety of the ship, he realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. "She is not the largest or most powerful vessel," continued their unexpected guide, "but she is certainly the most pretty, and that's what really matters, isn't it? Beauty? One can store up food and water to feed the body on long journeys, but only beauty can feed the soul. And what better way to store up beauty than in the vessel itself?" Gaius looked over at Jess, who looked over at him, and they both nodded their approval. Even Percy seemed to nod in affirmation of the veracity of the guide's wisdom. The Dragon Diamond was indeed a beautiful vessel, and one felt very welcomed aboard her decks. "Perhaps we can afford to give you an entire tour at a later time," she continued. "But for now, we shan't keep the captain waiting. His stateroom is through this door below the stern deck. Watch your head, please." She ushered Gaius, Jess, and Percy through decorative doors into a magnificent stateroom. Around the walls were white-painted wooden shelves with glass doors keeping everything in its place during voyages. These were filled with books, maps, and all manner of navigational instruments, as well as a large collection of what appeared to be small feminine hats of various shades of pink or blue. At the center was a large ornately carved wooden table bolted to the floor. It was clear that this was used as both a desk and a dinner table, depending upon circumstance. Currently, it was covered over with a wide assortment of sketches of flowers. Sunlight flooded the entire space, streaming through immense glass windows at the far side of the room that looked out upon the bustling dock of Portunus. And with little ceremony, their guide sat down on the edge of the red-cushioned chair on the opposite side of the flower-strewn table, holding her parasol umbrella sideways in her lap. She smiled up at them. Gaius looked around at the room, and then back at their guide. Suddenly it all clicked, and she noticed. "Ah, does the mysterious Lord Q finally understand?" she said. "Do you always welcome your patrons in so unorthodox a manner, Captain? Or should we consider ourselves blessed by your informality?" "I was simply adding to the magic of your visit," she insisted. "The opportunity presented itself to see your first unadulterated reaction to my dragon diamond, and I seized it." "And were you satisfied?" "Oh, very. Though it would have been more delectable had you not been wearing a mask." "Safety first," quipped Gaius. Finally, Jess couldn't take it anymore. He leaned over to Gaius and whispered, "Might I have a word with you?" They both turned around, and Jess whispered, "Did I miss something? What are you two going on about?" Turning back toward the woman, Gaius said loud and clear, "Master Jest, allow me to introduce you to Captain L.R. Featherton of the Dragon Diamond." Gaius paused. "L.R.?" "Lily Rose," said Captain Featherton. "My parents were rather fond of flowers." "As are you, it appears," responded Gaius as he looked upon the drawings of flowers upon the table. I am rather fond of all things beautiful, and yes, flowers are chief amongst them." "I can think of something else that is chief amongst them," said Gaius as he stared at the captain. Realizing what he had just said, he quickly averted his gaze and motioned toward the ship. "The Dragon Diamond is certainly a beauty to rival any flower. I would be very interested to see the internal machinations that control steering and elevation change." "Nice save," whispered Jess from beside him. Gaius elbowed him in the side. "Thank you, Lord Q," she said. "I believe our chief engineer would be more than happy to accommodate your request. In exchange, I could equally say that I'd be very interested to see the internal machinations that control the beautiful pet bird of yours." Percy gave an alarming tweet from Jess' shoulder. Gaius and Jess looked at each other. Gaius saw Jess' thoughts as clearly as he saw his own. Jess would never in a million years even dream of selling Percy. Gaius, on the other hand, was more practical. Had to be more practical. But right now Jess was looking to his big brother to defend the family heirloom. "I'm afraid I can't be as accommodating as you and your chief engineer, Captain," said Gaius from behind the mask. "Percy is an old friend rather than a pet. As such, he is not to be sold or disassembled." "Pity," she said, not taking her eyes off of Percy. "He is quite handsome, and I'm sure he'd fetch a hefty price at market. Oh well." She rang a small bell from the table. A small girl, no older than 14, arrived promptly at the door. Miss Hensley will show you to your cabin, Masters Jest and Percy. Lord Q, if you would be so kind as to join me on the bridge to enjoy the magic of the launch." "With pleasure," said Gaius. It was a fine day for sailing at sea or air. The sky was a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch on forever. A soft breeze from the west brought with it a refreshing cool to temper the half-sun's heat of midday, and all on deck was orderly and controlled. In a way, it felt something like Gaius's lab in that way. Everything had its proper place. Everything had a purpose. And even though the crew numbered at least a score, he still felt a solitary peace because no one seemed to pay him any attention or mind. It was clear to Gaius as they ascended the bridge why Portunus was considered by many to be the airship capital of the world. No other city sat at this high altitude with a sheer cliff face for ships to dock, board, and launch, and no other city was this centrally located on the world map. It was key to Portunus' status as an independent city-state to have control of both land, sea, and sky around its limits. Otherwise the danger of invasion or siege would ever be imminent. Upon arriving on the bridge, Gaius simply enjoyed the spectacle before him. Everything appeared in duplicate as the ship's balloon shimmered as a perfect mirror of silver, reflecting everything below it, including himself. He looked up and saw himself staring back at him from above. It was a very odd sensation. He didn't understand half the naval jargon he heard shouted from captain and crew, but he could quickly decipher their meaning from what he saw the crew doing. Some things he couldn't see at all. Unlike a sea ship with masts above deck, the Dragon Diamond had its sails billowing out below deck, underneath the ship. Every time the captain gave an order, a sailor with a large conical megaphone shouted down over the edge of the ship to convey the orders down below. What happened after that was beyond Gaius's powers of observation. Slowly, the ship began to move. It was a terribly weird sensation, for it was both gravity-defying and yet perfectly normal all at once. Gaius did not feel like he was flying as he had his feet firmly set upon the deck, no lighter or heavier than they were before. But something about the graceful motion of the ship conveyed a sense of lightness that made Gaius slightly dizzy. But as he watched the ship turn away from the dock and out into the open air, the rush of adventure and freedom overtook any sense of distress. "This is amazing," is all he could muster to say. "I agree," said the captain in her light voice. "What is our heading, Lord Q? As Lord Keystone instructed, you are now the owner and patron of the Dragon Diamond and her crew. We are at your disposal." Gaius smiled at this and looked toward the horizon. Every possibility lay open before him. For a split second he thought of running, of leaving Portunus behind forever and never returning. But then he thought of Jest and Percy and the rest of his family, and knew it would be impossible. He had a job to do first. "Best deal," he said. "We make for the Ithalian Empire." Captain Featherton nodded toward Gaius and then proceeded to give the proper orders to set a course. "So what do you think?" asked Gaius as he entered his cabin at the fore of the ship. He quickly removed his mask, thankful for a quick respite to cool off from its stifling heat. Jess was laying in his hammock, Percy roosting on the rope at his head. "Miss Hensley is awfully nice," said Jest. "She said she had never met a Dallar before, and she liked my horns." "I'm glad you've made a new friend," said Gaius. "And what about you and Miss Featherton? I saw that look you gave her in the stateroom." Captain Featherton, thank you. It was nothing, lied Gaius. I was nearly being a gentleman. Just think, said Jess as he put his hands behind his head and leaned back in his hammock. By the time we return home, we'll each have a girl to call our own. Did you not hear me? I said there's nothing between us. Mom will be so happy for us. Of course, she would prefer we find nice, sensible Dallor girls to marry, but I think she'll be happy regardless. You're incorrigible. You're unimaginative. And you're boring me, concluded Gaius. I'm going back on deck to find the chief engineer for this tour I was promised. Are you and Percy coming? I think I'm going to find the galley and see if I can scrounge up some food. Miss Hensley says we technically own all the food anyway, so I'm free to eat any time I want. Well, enjoy yourself. And what about you, Percy? Asked Gaius. Percy chirped excitedly and flew to Gaius' shoulder. Hey! Yelled Jest in betrayal. Gaius chuckled. I knew old Percy had more sense than you. Enjoy the free food that cost me an arm and a leg. Gaius closed the door of the cabin behind him and was slightly startled to find Miss Hensley waiting outside the door. She blushed deeply when she saw him. I was just checking in to make sure your cabin was in order, she said quickly. So, is it? In order, I mean? An understanding smile crept across Gaius' face. You know, I didn't get a good chance to look around the cabin and make sure everything was shipshape. My friend Jest has spent far more time there and would probably be able to give you a far more detailed summary of whether or not the cabin was in order. Miss Hensley beamed. Oh, well, in that case I should probably speak with Jest to make sure everything is to his liking. We are nothing except hospitable on the Dragon Diamond, she chortled as she entered the cabin door. I'm sure you are, he said with a smirk. You're welcome, little brother, he thought to himself. All right, Percy, he said aloud, let's go find the chief engineer. The Dragon Diamond was fascinating. Captain Featherton called it beautiful, but it was fascinating. Gaius couldn't get over the ingenuity of the craft. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was wasted, which allowed the craft to be small, fast, and very versatile. He made his way to the bridge from which he had witnessed the launch. He went to the stern of the craft and found what he was looking for. Multiple tanks of air stood there, mounted in brass brackets. Rubber hoses wound away from them and up the ropes that attached the ship to the balloon above. Gaius inspected the gauges on the tanks, noting the pressure of the balloon above. It was all so fascinating. He quickly discerned that to control the altitude of the craft, they would either pump regular air into the balloon, making it heavier, and therefore descending, or they would pump helium, making the balloon lighter, and therefore cause it to ascend higher into the air. Large brass wheels allowed the helmsman to control the flow of air from multiple tanks all at once, making it far more efficient in elevating or lowering the ship. Don't touch anything, said an annoyed voice from behind him. Gaius turned around and saw a balding, scrawny man with thick glasses. He wore the leather apron of an engineer, but his build and demeanor looked far more scholastic. Excuse me, said Gaius. Those capsules are perfectly calibrated for maximum efficiency, said the small man. For our current destination, we must maintain an altitude of 700 feet, which will minimize the use of hydrogen during the journey and the use of carbon dioxide when we land at Bastille. Maximum efficiency is maximum profits. Captain hates when we waste air. I'm sorry. Did you say hydrogen? Asked Gaius, assuming at this point that he was speaking to the chief engineer of the vessel. The chief engineer walked past Gaius, ignoring the question as he checked the gauges and made some calculations on a pad of paper. Everything seems to be in order. What was the captain thinking to allow an aeronautical layman on the bridge? Oh, and that's correct, he finally said without looking at the masked Gaius. Are you talking to me? Asked Gaius, being very confused. This is not an efficient conversation, said the chief engineer. Let me speak plainly so as not to repeat myself and thereby waste even more time. Yes, I said hydrogen earlier. We fill our balloon with hydrogen as it is vastly cheaper and more efficient in lifting the ship. Is that satisfactory? Hydrogen, cried Gaius. Do you mean to kill us all? Even a single spark would send us sky high. Yes, I'm well aware, cut in the chief engineer, which is why we take every precaution to prevent such stupidity from happening in the first place. Gaius still couldn't believe what he was hearing. What about during an attack? Surely you can't prevent a stray cannonball from blowing us right out of the sky with a single shot. The chief engineer grinned a mischievous grin. Do you know what is the single most important factor in aerial combat? Do you? Firepower? Wrong. Speed. Speed is everything in the skies. Up, down, left, right, forward, backwards. Whoever controls their speed controls the engagement, and whoever is faster survives. What does that have to do with stray cannonballs igniting the Zephyr? Everything. Haven't you been listening? Again, such inefficiency of conversation if you can't grasp even the most basic concepts. Speed, my good man. Speed is everything. How can a cannonball hit us if we can consistently outrun our foe? Hydrogen may be dangerous, but it makes us uncatchable and unmatched for speed. Our greatest liability becomes our greatest strength. I suppose, mumbled Gaius, still unconvinced of the chief engineer's logic, As if sensing Gaius's doubts, Percy let out a low tweet and then flew from his shoulder towards the balloon. He perched on one of the fastening lines on the balloon and proceeded to peck at its silvery surface with his beak. "Percy!" Gaius yelled. "Get down from there, this instant!" Percy stopped his pecking and turned to look at Gaius. As if to assert his independence, since it was not Gaius who had given him his blood, but rather Jest, Percy gave one final peck at the balloon, and then returned gracefully to Gaius's shoulder. Gaius looked over at the chief engineer, waiting for the inevitable flurry of furious words to erupt. Surely the arrogant little man would be fuming that the ship's Zephyr was threatened. But what he saw instead was far more troubling. The chief engineer stared at Percy with wide, greedy eyes, like those of a starving man seeing a roast turkey. "Is that an automaton?" he asked, as if in a daze, his index finger pointing at Percy almost in accusation. "Percy is a family friend," said Gaius, placing a protective hand over the bird. "And one with no winding key or mechanism," continued the chief engineer, completely ignoring Gaius's comment. "He's never needed a key. So it's a—" But the chief engineer stopped before saying anything more. "How much do you want for it?" Gaius very much doubted whether this chief engineer had access to the only thing he'd been willing to trade Percy for, but maybe he'd be able to arrange something to his satisfaction. It was worth a shot anyway, especially while Jest wasn't around. Before Gaius could open his mouth to begin negotiations, thunder rumbled in the distance. But it wasn't thunder. The chief engineer tackled Gaius to the ground, yelling out, "Get down!" at the top of his voice. A whining shriek ripped through the air, followed closely by a second. Cannonballs. Gaius held his breath, waiting for he knew not what. Explosions? Fire? Death? Captain Featherton ran onto the bridge and started giving orders. The entire crew leapt into action, including the chief engineer, leaving poor Gaius sprawled helplessly alone on the deck. For a split second, terror pinned him there. His hands covered his head, and his entire body shook, waiting for the second volley. But as he waited, something happened to him. He felt ashamed. His thoughts kept racing toward escape, toward hiding away, toward protecting himself at all cost. But those thoughts also made him a coward, and he was ashamed. With sheer will, he forced himself to stand up. It took every ounce of his strength to do it, but he stood. He was still shaking, but there was little he could do about that. The same for his pounding heart. But he could control his legs and his back, and with them he chose to stand tall. And as he stood, he looked across the railing and saw a dilapidated airship swooping down out of the overhanging clouds, flying a black flag blazoned with an image of a white eagle's skull. Pirates.